First of all, I just want to say there's nothing that's required to turn in based on this video. This is just a recap of the case against high school sports by Amanda Ripley. It's text one. It was homework last week. And she is concerned that the United States is spending lots of money and lots of time on high school sports when we are not doing very well, and she seems concerned about these international rankings. Where does the United States rank among the rest of the countries in the world in terms of what our kids can do, particularly in English and science and definitely math? And she starts off this article talking about this girl who she's named Jenny. This girl really exists. She's not using her real name, and she talks about this Shawnee High out of New Jersey. It's just a case in point. And then she talks specifically about Jenny, who is South Korean. And in South Korea, they're 15-year-olds. On a 2012 test in math, they rank fifth in the world. And that's what she has to say about that. And the reason why she says that is because she would also like to point out where the United States ranks, and she calls it mediocrity. It's international mediocrity. America's international mediocrity, meaning we're mediocre. And we, in 2012, on this math test, we ranked 36. 36. The supposed greatest country in the world, ranking 36 in math. That's essentially what she wants to say to you. Some more empirical data here. She points out that she surveyed 200 former exchange students, and she said 9 out of 10 of them, that's 90%, who had lived in the U.S., they said that kids here in the U.S. cared more about sports than their peers back home. So that, kids in the U.S. care about sports a lot. She's trying to point out in this graph that, well, that's the point. They care so much about sports that look at where we rank internationally when it comes to reading, mathematics, science. This is from that 2012 test that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development gives. It comes up again later in some of the other texts, but you can see, mathematically speaking, especially, we are lagging behind. What else does she point out here? Oh, here we go. She's still talking about Shawnee High here. She's like, well, look, it's middle, upper income families here at Shawnee, and then also in 2012, just 17% of the juniors and seniors took an AP test, but 50% of the kids enrolled as juniors and seniors in school played a sport. Kids care about sports. She points out that this woman who she knows or interviewed, Marguerite Rosa, so she analyzed the finances of, she doesn't name the public high school, but it's in the Pacific Northwest. She said that just taking a look at the school's spending, they were spending about $328 a student for math instruction and about 4 times more for cheerleading. And then she goes on to point out, this is a nice quote from Rosa, she says, in fact, the district's strategic plan for the last 3 years has claimed that math has been the primary focus. This is just one school, by the way. She doesn't even name it, but it's in the Pacific Northwest, which is quite a ways away from Jersey. Here on page 5, Ripley writes about certain sports, particularly football. She's like, well, look, football's like far and away the most expensive sport. All those coaches, they get a paycheck. Some schools hire professional coaches at full-time salaries. Then she talks about the facilities for a football field, bleachers, turf, maintaining a grass field, fixing up helmets every year. She's like, that stuff's expensive. She even writes down here about this Pasco County, Florida school who, they've been struggling. At the time of this article, they'd been struggling. They had considered squeezing the athletic budgets for the last 6 years. Instead, she's like, look, they've cut about 700 education jobs. They even extended winter break so that schools didn't have to be open during that time. But sports have been left mostly untouched. It's probably just a case in point. It's not just this one Florida school, but she does point out that this one Florida school district, I should say, not one school, but whole school district. And while we're focusing on sports, she's like, look, at this moment in time, now more than 20 countries are pulling off better high school graduation rates than we are. They're not offering sports. That's the point. And I like this. I wish I could use a different color, but she writes, using sports to tempt kids into getting an education feels dangerously old-fashioned. Like, we've been doing this for the past 50 years. Yeah, she even says it right here. We haven't been able to improve academic performance in the past 50 years because we're using an old school method that relies on athletics for a great deal for some reason. You might be able to hear it in my tone, but I'm just trying to I do coach 2 sports, but I am just trying to present her argument as logically as possible. But you might hear it in my tone like, oh yeah, a lot of this makes sense. Probably because a lot of this makes sense. She does offer another quotation that she gathered from Schleichler Andreas. And this guy's like, look, if you offer boring and poor math instruction and then you try to compensate that with interesting sports activities, yeah, you're going to get students who are interested in sports, but it's not going to do a whole lot for your math. That seems logical. More empirical data, some stats, and some data here. She goes back to South Korea, the U.S. ally, of course. And she's like, look, 93% of the students in South Korea are getting a high school diploma. 77% of them are getting a diploma in the United States. And mind you, about 2% of the 77% of Americans who are getting a high school diploma, about 2% of them are getting an athletic scholarship to college. 2% getting an athletic scholarship. Kind of a case study down here. She writes about these basis schools. Looks like they're in Texas and Arizona and Washington, D.C. They're charter schools modeled on rigorous international standards. She describes them at some length. Here we go. I don't know. She makes a big deal about what they do academically versus what they don't do athletically. And they do offer some athletics. It's on a kind of a scaled down basis, but she points out that the AP kids came out to maybe my favorite song from my childhood, Eye of the Tiger. They come out to that theme song before they go into their AP tests, and then she's trying to point out that they take their academics seriously. And she says that in 2012, everything goes back to 2012. So everything in this article is based on 2012 stats. She says 15-year-olds at 2 of the Arizona basis schools took a new test designed to compare the individual schools' performances with that from around the world. She's like, look, American students can do it. They can show that they are some of the best performers in the world. She's like, the average basis student not only outperformed the typical American student by 3 years in reading and science, and by 4 years in math. 4 years in math. 15-year-olds. It means some 15-year-olds are operating on like an 11-year-old math basis. Or that these 15-year-olds are operating on a 19-year-old basis. But they also outscored students in Finland and Korea and Poland. They even did better than kids in Shanghai and China, where those kids have been hanging on to the #1 world ranking in math and oftentimes reading and science for years and years and years. So, look, American students can certainly perform on the world stage in reading and science and math. She's just saying sports are getting in the way of some of that. School sports are getting in the way of some of that.